so it's Halloween, or more likely some random day in November, and the spooky season is upon us. Or like I said, it's probably already passed. Anyway, a tradition I always like to take part in this time of year is playing through some horror games. Last year I decided to play Corpse Party, and it was kind of garbage, so this year I want to change that by consuming as much garbage as possible. And what better way to find terrible horror games than by scouring the endless dumpster fire of the internet? Ever since the rise of creepypastas in the early 2010s, the web has become a cornucopia of free horror content. Nowadays, any kid with a brain cell count in the single digits can log onto their mom's Windows 7 laptop and have their mind blown by a picture of Squidward. Creepypastas have been around since the early 2000s in the form of short scary stories copied and pasted into message boards to trick people into thinking they were real. Now though, they're more seen as just scary stories you can find on the internet. In my head, I split online horror into one of two categories: creepypastas and horror games. Of course, you can't lump all horror into one of these two categories, but I would say that this accounts for 95% of stuff you'd find online. So I won't be looking too much into actual written creepypastas today, but I will be covering horror games. Horror games is another genre of internet content that got a boost in the early 2010s, probably because everybody was obsessed with Swedish people screaming random nonsense while they play them. I personally credit Let's Plays to the rise of freeware horror games, as before they blew up I honestly can't remember hearing of a single one. But 2012 and on, you got Slender, Ao Oni, Mad Father, Sonic.EXE, Jeff the Killer, tons of free horror games. I don't think most of these games are particularly good, but there are certainly a lot of them. So that's why today I wanted to revisit some old horror classics and see if they stand the test of time. Although looking at some of them, I don't have my hopes set very high. Slender Man is probably the most famous creepypasta of all time, and I would also consider the game based on the mythos to be equally popular. There are a countless amount of YouTube videos, many of them with over 1 million views, all covering this game. I'm sure that you've probably heard of it at some point if you haven't already played the game. I like to imagine that Slender kind of kicked off the whole genre of horror Let's Plays. The game was released in 2012, and as far as I can remember, there wasn't a whole lot of online content about horror games. I guess you could say Amnesia counts, since that was released in 2010, but that was more of a paid, commercial, published release, so I don't really count it. Anyway, the goal of Slender is to collect 8 pages scattered around a forest before the Slender Man gets you. And that's really it. When I went and revisited it, I originally really liked the quiet yet creepy atmosphere, but then I remembered about 5 minutes in that there isn't much else. You just have to slowly walk around, occasionally turning your flashlight off to save battery, and hope you get all 8 pages before your invisible time limit runs out. There's no map, and although the forest is pretty small, I found myself getting lost pretty easily. That makes finding the pages a pretty tedious experience, although the appearance of the actual Slender Man does change things up a little. After a while, you'll find yourself running into Slender Man, who can randomly show up at any location. However, once you get used to him, he's pretty easy to avoid. All you have to do is turn away from him and run in the other direction. There's also the fact that he shows up randomly, so you could have long stretches where he just doesn't show up at all. In fact, during my first playthrough, I think I encountered Slender Man maybe once before my time ran out. I like the spooky atmosphere of wandering around a quiet forest at night, but once you realize that Slender Man's not much of a threat, it just becomes a slog. I really liked exploring the cramped bathroom, but other than that, there isn't much variety in the landmarks you encounter. It would have been cool if there were more interesting landmarks other than tube and car. Maybe if the map was smaller and there was like an old house to check out or something, it would have been more interesting, but at the end of the day, it's not much more than a boring horror game. I don't think I need an introduction to Sonic.EXE. What started as a cliche creepypasta about an evil Sonic became a revolution that I still don't understand. This story has apparently traumatized a generation of kids who now think that putting .exe at the end of names makes them demonic. Do they know that an exe is just a type of file? What goes through their heads when they see VLC Media Player.exe? Anyway, for some reason, tons of people were just so inspired by the exploits of a red-eyed Sonic that there are countless numbers of fan games out there. Apparently all you need to do to make a character scary is make their eyes bleed and add a file extension to the end of their name. So the story of Sonic.exe is really basic. Guy gets mysterious disc, weird things happen, and then the narrator dies or something. There's not much to say. What you're seeing here is the fan-made game that is described in the story. I must say, it is a well-made translation. It's certainly faithful to the source material, but that doesn't really mean that it's good. I mean, the creator didn't have much to work with in the first place, but still. All you do is run to the right and spooky things happen. There is a secret ending accessed by sometimes going left. I know, it's crazy, but it's really just more too spooky for you content. Do people even say too spooky for you anymore? My favorite part, however, has to be the inclusion of voice acting.
You're too slow. Want to try again?
Amazing. I feel like the game is what catapulted Sonic.EXE to stardom. It's just a well-done interpretation of the classic lost game genre, because otherwise the story itself doesn't stand out that much. To be honest, I have a bit of appreciation for the lost genre of creepypastas. After you read a couple, they all become pretty similar, but I like to go and read some from time to time. There's something really interesting in a way a lot of these creepypastas sort of mimic nightmares or night terrors a kid would realistically have, like we're reading the nightmare log of a cartoon aficionado. It's certainly not intentional, but cool nonetheless. Also, I'm usually not convinced by ghost stories or anything like that, so seeing something that could actually be out there on some obscure website is a nice change of pace. I seem to gravitate towards the ones that give more questions than answers, instead of explaining that it's the work of some ghost or evil hedgehog demon. SpongeBob Bootleg episode is a really interesting one because it's less of a bloody eyes, hyper-realistic lost episode, and more like a leaked MKUltra experiment that just happens to have SpongeBob in it. My favorite little subgenre of this are the lost PC games, because they're ones that could feasibly exist. Pale Loon is a short but sweet example. I have a distinct memory of explaining the entire story of Mr. Mix to my friend 6 years ago. I don't really remember why I did that, but if you're watching this, you know who you are. I was actually quite surprised by Ao-Oni. There's a whole bunch of horror games out there that were created in RPG Maker, and Ao-Oni is without a doubt the most famous example. Even if you weren't around during its peak, you've definitely seen the iconic design of the Oni. Honestly, a very cool design. It's a low-budget indie game, but the uncanny valley is used to great effect to make a simple yet striking monster. I bet even if I saw this today, I would still think it's kind of off-putting. Interestingly enough, Ao-Oni was originally released in 2008 as a very different game, but the one that's probably most familiar to Westerners is the 2011 release, version 6.23. This is the version played by all the Let's Players, and to be honest, I thought this was the only version available until recently. The story of Ao-Oni is very simple. 4 teens go into an abandoned mansion and are chased by the Oni. And that's about it. There's no overarching mystery, the Oni is never explained, and the characters are basically non-existent, but it really doesn't matter. It's just a fun little horror puzzle game. The mansion is easy to get around, unlike Slender, and it's actually fun and interesting to play. The puzzles never felt too cheap, and the Oni will randomly show up to chase you to break up the monotony of walking around. If he catches you, it's game over, but you're able to save anywhere, meaning that you'll never lose a whole lot of progress. It's actually pretty atmospheric, too. There's no music aside from when you're being chased, but there's plenty of sound effects and the silence can be kinda creepy. The randomness of the Oni also makes you feel like you're never truly safe. For an old RPG Maker game, it's spooky. Nothing terrifying, obviously, but I was still surprised by the sheer variety of scares one could find while playing the game. It's only about an hour, but there are a bunch of memorable set pieces. That's another great thing about it, it's only an hour. There's no padding and everything, even the little puzzles you do feels like it gets you closer to escaping the mansion. I'm hard pressed to find anything really wrong with it. It strives to be a simple classic horror game and it executes it basically flawlessly. Apparently the Japanese seem to think so too. Ao-Oni is huge there, it's been adapted into basically every medium you can think of. Novels, manga, an anime series, an anime film, and 2 live-action movies. I'll never understand how they were able to fit 2 full-length movies to span the plot of an hour-long game, but I'm even more confused by the first movie's trailer and its very odd music choice. Also, the monster design? Soulless. Anyway, I could say more about the game, but I don't want to spoil any of its cooler moments. I didn't think I was going to say this, but I definitely recommend Ao-Oni. So that was a small collection of various free horror games from way back when. Most of them aren't very good, but there's a certain charm to downloading a bunch of indie games and checking out how scary they can be. Usually they're not, but I still think it's pretty fun. Although there aren't as many Lost Game or .exe creepypastas anymore, there are still tons of free horror stuff coming out, so I feel that I won't run out of unique horror games for a long time to come. Merry Christmas.